At 7:32 on the morning of February 10th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch stared in horror as 6 Japanese Zero fighters plummeted toward his F4F Wildcats above Wake Island. The 37-year-old pilot, with 214 flight hours in Wildcats and no victories against Zeros to his name, knew his men had barely 90 seconds to live. The odds were cruel and unforgiving. 18 Mitsubishi A6M0s had been dispatched to clear American patrols from the sky, and every pilot on both sides understood the deadly reality. The Zero outclassed the Wildcat in every key metric. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and outmaneuvered any American fighter at any altitude. The math was brutal and unrelenting. A Zero could outturn a Wildcat in just 14 seconds. 14 seconds to get on your tail, 14 seconds to line up its guns, and 14 seconds to end your life. By February 1942, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in one-on-one dogfights with Zeros. Each loss represented a pilot who tried to match the Zero's turns, each a funeral, each a family receiving a devastating telegram. The cycle never changed. An American pilot spotted a Zero, turned to engage, was outmaneuvered and shot down. Naval Command issued the same futile orders. Avoid turning fights, run if possible. But running meant abandoning fellow pilots, letting Zeros strafe helpless buddies while you fled. As commander of Fighting Squadron 3, Thatch bore the weight of responsibility for 4 men who trusted him with their lives. Yet he had no answer for the Zero's superior turn radius or climb rate. No answer except to watch good men die. 3 days earlier, in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, Thatch sat staring at a simple pack of wooden matches. Sent by his wife in a care package, the 20 matches in their thin cardboard box became the focus of his desperate ruminations. For weeks, he'd grappled with an impossible question. How do you defeat an enemy that's faster, more agile, and flown by pilots with 2 years of combat experience? Thatch picked up 2 matches, holding them parallel before weaving them past each other, crossing repeatedly, never separating, always supporting one another. In that moment, a breakthrough struck. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight alone? What if they flew as a pair, weaving back and forth? If a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's tail, that pilot would turn toward his wingman, who would turn toward him. The pursuing Zero would fly directly into the wingman's line of fire. It was a radical idea, violating every U.S. Navy fighter doctrine. Since 1918, pilots had been trained to split up and fight one-on-one once combat began. Pairs existed only for navigation, but Thatch couldn't shake the image of those weaving matches or the memory of 43 dead pilots. That night, he summoned his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, to his quarters. He demonstrated the weave with the matches, explaining his theory. O'Hare studied the moving sticks for 30 seconds before asking the only question that mattered. When do we test it? 4 days later, over Wake Island, Thatch was about to find out if his matchstick trick would save lives or get 4 pilots killed. The 6 Zeros closed in at 2,200 yards, their approach rapid and menacing. Thatch's hand moved to the radio. This was the moment to try something never before attempted in combat. "Weave on my mark," he announced. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, flew 800 feet to his right. Ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Coulson trailed 1,000 feet beyond Bassett in 2 more Wildcats, forming a loose line. The Zeros dove from 11,000 feet, while standard doctrine screamed for the Americans to split up and fight independently. Instead, Thatch issued an order never before heard in U.S. Navy combat. "Bassett on me, weave pattern, execute." Bassett turned his Wildcat toward Thatch, who turned toward him, flying directly at each other. Japanese pilots likely thought the Americans were panicking, that a collision was imminent, but at 400 yards, both pilots banked hard. Thatch left, Bassett right, crossing paths with 200 feet of separation before turning to cross again, forming a figure-8 pattern that mirrored the matches on Thatch's desk. The lead Zero targeted Bassett, closing to 600 yards with the standard tactic. Use superior maneuverability to get close and hammer the target with 20mm cannon fire. The Japanese pilot expected Bassett to turn and fight, an easy kill, but Bassett turned toward Thatch instead. The Zero followed, lining up its guns as it closed to 400 yards just 3 seconds from firing. Suddenly, Thatch's Wildcat screamed through the weave from the opposite direction. The Zero pilot faced an impossible choice: break off the attack or fly into a wall of bullets from Thatch's 6.50 caliber machine guns, firing 70 rounds per second. He pulled hard right and climbed away. The other 5 Zeros scattered. For the first time in Pacific combat, Zeros were running from Wildcats. Sheedy and Coulson watched the tactic work and quickly adopted it, turning toward each other to form another weaving pair. A Zero latched onto Coulson's tail, closing to 400 yards before Sheedy came through the pattern, forcing the Japanese pilot to disengage. After 6 minutes of fighting, the Zeros retreated northwest. All 4 American Wildcats remained airborne. No hits, no casualties. The weave had worked. 40 minutes later, Thatch landed at Ford Island, his hands shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline, and the realization that American pilots might not have to die every time they face Zeros. That afternoon, he filed a detailed combat report, describing the weave, explaining its mechanics, and urging immediate adoption across all fighter squadrons. 3 days later, the response came back. Interesting tactic. Needs further testing, not approved for widespread use. Thatch stared at the words in disbelief. 43 pilots had died in February alone, and command wanted more tests. Meanwhile, the Japanese were planning a massive offensive, one that would put the weave to the ultimate test. In 68 days, Thatch would fly over Midway Island, facing 50 Zeros with just 8 Wildcats. Between February and June 1942, John Thatch trained Fighting Squadron 3 in the weave every single day. Morning flights, afternoon drills, and night formations. When the moon was bright enough, his pilots practiced until they could execute the pattern blind. The concept was simple. Turn toward your wingman, cross paths, turn back, cross again. But at 300 miles per hour with Zeros firing at you, it was brutally challenging. The Navy still hadn't officially approved the tactic, but Thatch refused to wait. He taught it to any pilot who would listen, using matches to demonstrate and diagrams on blackboards to explain the geometry. If a Zero gets on your tail, turn into your wingman, he'd say. The enemy has 2 choices: follow you into your wingman's guns or break off. Either way, you survive. Some pilots grasped it immediately. Others thought Thatch was crazy. One squadron commander argued the weave violated basic fighter doctrine. You can't fly toward another aircraft in combat. You'll collide, panic, and get both pilots killed. But Thatch persisted, driven by the rising death toll. By May, the Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats to Zeros, 91 funerals, 91 letters to grieving families. While command continued to issue the same useless orders: avoid engagement, run if outnumbered. To Thatch, it was equivalent to telling pilots to give up and die. Then, naval intelligence made a breakthrough. Code breakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor decrypted Japanese radio traffic, revealing plans for a massive assault on Midway Island. The Japanese would deploy 4 aircraft carriers in 270 aircraft, the largest carrier operation in their naval history, scheduled for June 4, 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz rallied every available American carrier: Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. The odds were dire: 3 U.S. carriers against 4 Japanese, inexperienced American pilots against veterans, and Wildcats outmatched by Zeros in every performance category. Midway's runway would be reduced to rubble in the first 30 minutes of the attack. On May 26th, Fighting Squadron 3 received deployment orders: report to the USS Yorktown and prepare for carrier operations. Thatch knew what this meant. His squadron would fly combat air patrol over the Yorktown, defending it from bombers and fighting Zeros, with survival far from guaranteed. That evening, he gathered his 7 pilots, laid out the matches one last time, and told them the truth. The Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway, maybe more. We'll have 8 Wildcats, maybe fewer. The only way we survive, the only way we protect the Yorktown, the only way we win, is the weave. When a pilot asked, "What if it doesn't work?" Thatch had no easy answer. He just moved the matches back and forth, showing how 2 sticks could cover each other, protect each other, and survive when alone they couldn't. The Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th, leaving 4 days to reach Midway, 4 days to prepare for a battle that would decide the Pacific War, and 4 days to pray that a matchstick trick could stand against 50 screaming Zeros. At 0930 hours on June 4th, Thatch looked up from 14,000 feet above the Yorktown and saw the first Japanese strike wave, 18 Aichi dive bombers escorted by 12 Zeros. Not the 50 intelligence had predicted, but still a 3-to-1 advantage against his four-plane section. The Zeros approached from 15,000 feet, following standard Japanese doctrine. Establish altitude superiority, dive on enemy fighters, and use speed and maneuverability to dominate. Thatch counted the enemy, then keyed his radio. Weave pattern, execute on my mark. Bassett flew 600 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats trailed behind. As the Zeros dove, 3 targeted Thatch, 4 went after Bassett, and the rest headed for the Yorktown. Mark, execute, Thatch ordered. He and Bassett turned toward each other, crossing paths at 12,000 feet. The 3 Zeros chasing Thatch suddenly faced a problem. Their target was flying directly at another Wildcat with guns pointed at them. The lead Zero hesitated for 2 seconds, but at combat speed, that was 400 yards of opportunity. Thatch opened fire, and .50 caliber rounds tore through the Zero's engine cowling. The enemy fighter rolled left, trailing black smoke, and fell away. Thatch's first confirmed Zero kill. But the remaining 2 Zeros adapted. Instead of sticking to Thatch's tail, they split, one high, one low, attacking from different angles to force him into a choice. Thatch turned toward the high Zero. Bassett went after the low one. For 6 seconds, the weave fractured, and both Wildcats fought alone, exactly what Thatch had sought to avoid. The high Zero got Thatch in its sights at 800 yards, and 20mm cannon fire tore up his left wing. 2 rounds punched through the wing root. One shattered his canopy just 3 inches from his head. Thatch felt the shock wave and aluminum fragments hitting his flight suit, but he kept turning. Over the radio, Bassett shouted, "I'm hit! Repeat, I'm hit!" Thatch glanced left to see Bassett's Wildcat trailing white smoke. A coolant leak, possibly worse, with the low Zero still hammering him. Thatch made a split-second decision. Abandon his chase and dive toward Bassett. The weave pattern was broken, but the principle held. Get between your wingman and the threat. He attacked the low Zero from 7 o'clock high, closing to 400 yards before opening fire. The Zero exploded in midair, its debris tumbling downward. Bassett's engine overheated, and he radioed his intent to return to the Yorktown. Thatch ordered him to go, assigning the other 2 Wildcats to escort him, leaving himself alone at 11,000 feet with 10 Zeros still in the sky. Without a wingman, Thatch was just another vulnerable Wildcat pilot, until 3 Zeros spotted him and turned to intercept. He scanned the horizon for help, spotting 4 friendly Wildcats 3 miles east, too far to assist. Running would lead the Zeros straight to the Yorktown, betraying his mission to protect the carrier. So Thatch keyed his radio, calling for backup, informing the other pilots he was engaging 3 Zeros solo. "If the weave works, you'll have proof," he said. "If not, tell my wife I loved her." Then he turned his Wildcat toward the oncoming Zeros, determined to test if the weave's principle could save a single pilot. At 9,000 feet, the Zeros entered firing range. Thatch had no wingman, no support, but 4 months of studying the weave's geometry gave him an insight. The tactic didn't require 2 aircraft. It required 2 points in space. He pulled hard right, then immediately reversed left, executing sharp angular turns instead of the smooth maneuvers Zeros expected. The lead Zero followed his right turn, but Thatch was already going left, forcing the Japanese pilot to correct, pull harder, and burn precious energy. He repeated the pattern, right turn, left reversal, keeping the Zeros half a second behind, always reacting, always losing speed and altitude. After 40 seconds, the lead Zero was at the same altitude and speed as Thatch, with no advantage left. It broke off and climbed away. The other 2 followed. Thatch had proven the weave's principle worked even solo. Constant direction changes, denying the enemy predictability, making them bleed energy until they quit. 20 minutes later, he landed on the Yorktown. Bassett had safely returned, his Wildcat damaged but intact. The other pilots of Fighting Squadron 3 watched Thatch's solo fight in awe, and word spread through the fleet that afternoon, Thatch's weave worked, even alone, even outnumbered. By evening, pilots from the Enterprise and Hornet were begging Thatch to teach them the tactic. He demonstrated with matches, drew diagrams, and practiced reversals with them. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could execute the Weave. By June 6th, that number doubled to 32. The tactic spread faster than any official doctrine in Navy history. Japanese intelligence took notice. Radio intercepts from June 7th mentioned American fighters flying in coordinated pairs, executing unpredictable maneuvers, and refusing to be shot down. One Japanese commander's message warned, "American Wildcat pilots have changed their methods. Expect increased resistance." On June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 faced 14 Zeros near Midway with 8 Wildcats. All 4 pairs executed the Weave, and despite the Zeros' attempts to isolate individual pilots, the pattern held. After 12 minutes, the Zeros retreated, having damaged 2 Wildcats but scored no kills, while the Americans shot down 3 Zeros. It was the first time in Pacific combat that Wildcats achieved a positive kill ratio against Zeros in a major engagement. Fighter Command finally paid attention. On June 15th, Thatch received orders to report to Pearl Harbor to brief Admiral Nimitz on the Weave. He spent 2 days preparing diagrams, combat footage, pilot testimonials, and survival statistics. Everything needed to prove the tactic worked. But while Thatch prepared, the Japanese were adapting too. They'd analyzed the Weave and developed a counter tactic, a coordinated 3-directional attack designed to break the pattern and kill both Wildcats in a pair. On June 23rd over Santa Cruz Island, Fighting Squadron 3 would face 18 Zeros trained to defeat the Weave. At 08:15 hours on June 23, 1942, Fighting Squadron 3 was escorting a convoy near Santa Cruz Island when radar detected 18 inbound bogies from the northwest, 12 miles away. Thatch's 8 Wildcats formed 4 pairs in standard Weave formation. 3 days earlier, he'd briefed Admiral Nimitz, who authorized field testing of the Weave across Pacific fighter squadrons. Now, Thatch realized the Japanese had done their homework. The Zeros approached at 16,000 feet but didn't dive immediately, unlike their usual tactics of striking fast to exploit altitude advantage. Instead, they circled for 90 seconds, waiting. Thatch understood. They were coordinating. 6 Zeros broke left, 6 right, and 6 stayed high. 3 groups attacking from 3 angles. The Japanese knew 2 Wildcats could protect each other from one direction, but not 3 simultaneously. At 08:17 hours, the attack began. 6 diving from above, 6 from the left flank, 6 from the right. Thatch called for the Weave, but his pilots hesitated, uncertain which threat to counter. Bassett turned toward the high Zeros, exposing his right flank. Another pilot broke to cover him, fracturing his own pair's Weave. Suddenly, all 4 pairs were fighting independently, exactly what the Japanese wanted. Thatch shouted over the radio, "Reform pairs, lock on to your wingmen, execute standard Weave, ignore the other groups." His pilots responded, with Bassett reconnecting with his wingman and re-establishing the pattern. The high Zeros dove, but when they chased Bassett, they flew into his wingman's guns. 2 exploded and the rest pulled up. The left group attacked Thatch's pair, but the Weave held, and 1 Zero was shot down after flying through the crossing pattern. The right group targeted Sheedy's pair, with the same result. A Zero crashed and the others retreated. After 8 minutes of fighting, the Japanese had lost 5 Zeros. The Americans had lost none. The 3-directional counter tactic had failed, but Thatch recognized its significance. The Japanese were taking the Weave seriously enough to train pilots specifically to defeat it. That evening, he filed an urgent report describing the coordinated attack and how the Weave held despite it. He demanded immediate widespread adoption. No more testing, no more evaluation. The Weave works against the standard tactics. It works against adapted tactics. It works, period. Admiral Nimitz received the report on June 25th and forwarded it to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King reviewed the kill ratios, 5 Japanese losses, 0 American, and survival statistics, 8 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros, and acted decisively. On June 29th, he issued Fleet Order 41-1942. The Thatch Weave was officially adopted as standard combat doctrine for all Pacific Fleet fighter squadrons, with mandatory training and execution in all engagements. The matchstick trick was now U.S. Navy policy. But official orders took time to reach every squadron, and the Japanese weren't waiting. On July 7th, over Guadalcanal, 32 Zeros attacked 12 Wildcats from 6 squadrons. 4 pilots trained in the Weave, 8 not. The results were stark. After 22 minutes, 6 Wildcats were shot down, all flown by pilots who fought independently. The 4 Weave-trained pilots survived without damage, claiming 7-0 kills. Admiral William Halsey read the report and issued an order. Every South Pacific fighter pilot would learn the Thatch Weave within 2 weeks, no exceptions. Thatch flew to Guadalcanal and spent 3 weeks teaching the tactic to every squadron on the island, morning briefings, afternoon flight drills, evening debriefs. He used matches, diagrams, and demonstration flights to teach pilots of all experience levels. By August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could execute the Weave. By September 1st, that number grew to 214. The tactic spread beyond Wildcats to P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, and even bomber formations adapting the crossing pattern for defense. It crossed oceans, moving from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from carriers to land bases. The impact was dramatic. In June 1942, before the Weave became doctrine, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.4 to 1 against zeros. 4 Japanese shot down for every 10 Americans lost. By October 1942, after widespread adoption, the ratio flipped to 2.1 to 1, 2 zeros down for every American loss. Japanese pilots grew to hate the tactic. Radio intercepts revealed commanders warning their men, "Do not commit to tail chase. Do not follow American fighters into their wingman's guns. Disengage if Americans execute coordination tactics." But disengaging meant surrendering air superiority, letting American fighters protect their bombers, and losing the fight. The Zero remained faster and more maneuverable, but those advantages meant nothing if they couldn't get guns on target, and the Weave made that nearly impossible. By January 1943, the Weave was standard doctrine across all U.S. fighter squadrons, adopted by the Army Air Force, Marine Corps, and even British Royal Navy carrier pilots. What began with 2 matches on a San Diego desk had become the foundation of Allied fighter tactics. In February 1943, Thatch was awarded the Navy Cross, with a citation honoring his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives. But Thatch cared more about numbers than medals. In the 6 months before the Weave, the Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats to zeros. In the 6 months after, just 41, 96 pilots came home because of the Weave. In March 1943, Fighter Command reassigned Thatch to training duty in San Diego, pulling him from combat. He hated being away from the fight, but Command insisted he was more valuable as an instructor, saving lives by teaching the Weave than by using it. Over 18 months, he trained more than 800 naval aviators, each taking the tactic into combat and surviving situations that should have been fatal. When World War II ended in August 1945, 40-year-old Thatch had flown 73 combat missions, scored 6 confirmed kills, and earned 2 distinguished flying crosses and 3 air medals. But none of that compared to the statistic that mattered. Over 2,000 American pilots survived the war because they knew how to weave. Thatch faced a choice after the war: return to civilian life or stay in the Navy. His wife wanted him home, his children barely knew him, and he'd been away for 4 years. But he couldn't walk away from teaching, from pilots who needed to survive. He stayed in the Navy for 27 more years, rising through the ranks: commander in 1946, captain in 1952, rear admiral in 1960. He commanded carrier groups during the Korean War, never flying combat again, but his pilots did, all of them trained in the Weave. Korean War pilots officially named it the Thatch Weave, the only military tactic in history to bear a pilot's name while he was still alive. During the Vietnam War, the Weave evolved. F4 Phantom pilots adapted it for supersonic speeds, calling it the Fluid 4 formation. Same principle, same crossing pattern, just faster. It worked against North Vietnamese MiG-710s, which could outturn the F4 just as Zeros had outturned Wildcats. The Weave proved effective at 600 miles per hour as it had at 300. Thatch retired in 1973 as a 4-star admiral with 40 years of service, returning to San Diego to live quietly. He rarely spoke of the war or the 2,000 pilots he'd saved. When reporters asked about the Weave, he always said the same thing: It wasn't genius, it was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home. Fighter pilots never forgot him. Every year on February 10th, the anniversary of the first Weave combat test, naval aviators from across the country called to thank him, sharing stories of how the tactic had saved their lives or their wingmen's. In 1981, the Navy named Thatch Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola, a fighter pilot training facility, where every aviator earning their wings walks past a bronze plaque bearing Thatch's face, in 3 words: innovate, adapt, survive. John Thatch died on April the 15th, 2001, at the age of 86. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew over 300 naval aviators, men in their 70s and 80s who'd flown Wildcats in 1943, Phantoms in 1967, and Hornets in 1991, all alive because one commander had thought about matchsticks. Today, the Thatch Weave is still taught at every U.S. military fighter pilot school, Navy, Air Force, Marines, adapted for stealth fighters and beyond visual range combat, but rooted in the same principle: 2 aircraft protecting each other, turning toward each other, crossing paths, surviving together. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Thatch's original pack of matches is preserved in a glass case next to a model F4F Wildcat. The label reads, "Lieutenant Commander John Thatch used these matches to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots during World War II." School groups walk past without stopping, but fighter pilots always pause. They look at those simple wooden sticks and understand. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this forgotten piece of history with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories of courage and innovation from dusty archives every week. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from: Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan, and if someone in your family served. You're not just a viewer, you're keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring John Thatch's legacy never fades into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.